Hi, welcome to this tutorial video for biology class. This is for your textbook chapter 2.1 titled Atoms, Ions, and Molecules. Our main idea for this video is that all living things are based on atoms and their interactions. And I'll tell you what I mean by interactions a little bit later on in the video. Now, a lot of you know about atoms, and that's great. That means this video will be just a little bit of a review for you, and that's awesome. So let's build upon your already pre-existing knowledge of atoms. So I want to start with this video, or this picture here, which is a picture of the organization of biology. And I want to point out that in this video, we're talking about the left-hand side of this diagram here with atoms and molecules. So atoms get together and make molecules. In fact, this molecule you see right here that I'm circling with my cursor is a water molecule. One atom of oxygen and two atoms of hydrogen. So atoms get together and make molecules, and some of those molecules can be quite big. Those molecules get together and make cells. Cells get together to make tissues, which are groups of cells that do a specific purpose. Organs are made of tissues, and those organs get together to make organ systems to make a complex organism finally. So in this organization of biology, I want you to realize that we are way on the left-hand side talking about atoms and molecules. So keep in mind that we are talking about things that are smaller than cells, and if we're talking about atoms, we're actually talking about things that are smaller than molecules. So let's go ahead and get started with atoms. So most of you know about atoms. You've learned about that in previous science classes, so let's do this pretty quickly. Protons are positively charged particles that are in the nucleus of the atom. Neutrons are also in the nucleus of the atom, and they have no charge. They have a neutral charge. Electrons are sort of flying or orbiting around that nucleus of that atom, and they are negatively charged. In fact, the negative charge of the electron and the positive charge of the proton actually help hold that atom together, and we'll talk more about electrons later on in this video. So let's talk quickly about the atomic symbols that you can find on the periodic table. This tells us information about the element that we're talking about, in this case helium, He. The 2 in this symbol is the atomic number. It's the number of protons in the atom. And of course the He is the symbol for this type of element, an atom, and that's helium, and it happens to use the H and the E from the word helium, and that helps remind us that's what it is, but that isn't always the case, as you'll see later on in the video. And finally, the number at the bottom of the symbol is the atomic mass. And that's not too much of a concern for us because this is not chemistry class, but because this is our biochemistry unit, I do want you to know what that number actually means. And so that's the average mass of this type of atom. So here's another example, carbon, again C for carbon. It has 6 protons because its atomic number is 6. It also has 6 electrons because in a normal atom of carbon, and in all normal atoms, the number of protons and the number of electrons equal each other. Remember, one is positively charged and one is negatively charged, and they sort of attract each other and help hold that atom together. And if there wasn't the same number of protons and electrons, that atom would, its properties would actually change a little bit. To find out the number of neutrons, we have to take the atomic mass, which in this case is 12, and subtract 6, which is the atomic number, the number of protons, and we actually get the number of neutrons. So in the nucleus of a carbon atom, you would find 6 protons and 6 neutrons. It just so happens that all of these numbers are equal, protons, electrons, and neutrons for carbon, but it isn't always the case with all atoms. Sometimes you can have different numbers of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, for example. Here's a picture of what a carbon atom might look like if you were to draw it. You would draw 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the nucleus, or the center of that atom, and then you would draw 6 electrons orbiting the nucleus of that atom. And we'll talk about the arrangement of the electrons here. There's 2 in the first energy orbital, and there's 4 for a total of 6 in that second energy orbital. So we'll talk about the arrangement of these electrons, but electrons, as it turns out, are the most important part of the atom moving forward in our video. So ions, which is our next important term here, are atoms that have gained electrons or lost electrons. They're still whatever atom they are, they just have gained 1 or more electrons, and we call these ions. So in this case, we have a sodium atom, and sodium atoms readily lose electrons. In fact, they usually lose just 1. So when it loses that electron, it's going to be slightly positively charged because it's lost a negative part of itself. And so the overall charge on that atom, because there's 1 more proton than there is electrons, and because protons are positively charged, the sodium ion is slightly positively charged. In fact, it has a positive charge of +1. Now, sodium atoms just don't do this just for the heck of it. They do it when they're in close association with other atoms that will gain electrons. In this case, chlorine is an atom that will readily gain electrons. So again, sodium readily gives up electrons, and chlorine is an atom that will readily accept electrons. And when sodium does it, it becomes slightly positively charged, and when chlorine accepts that electron, it becomes slightly negatively charged because it's actually gained a negative thing. It's gained one negatively charged electron. And if they're close to each other, those two charges, the positive and negative, will actually attract each other. And so the sodium and the chlorine will become attached to each other, and they'll actually form an ionic bond. That's how two atoms will actually stick to each other and form something a little bit more complex than the sodium and the chlorine when they're separate. And when they're together, we call them sodium chloride, or NaCl, using the symbols from the periodic table. And NaCl should be a compound that's familiar to you. It's just table salt. And when multiple NaCl compounds get together, they do so in a crystalline fashion. That's why if you looked at table salt up close with a magnifying glass, for example, you'd see that it's a bunch of small crystals. Now, ionic bonds aren't the only way that two or more atoms can come together and be bonded. We also have a different kind of bond called a covalent bond, and this is where the two or more atoms, share electrons. Remember, in a ionic bond, one atom is donating an electron or losing an electron, and actually donating it or giving it to another atom that's accepting it, and the two charges that result of that are the charges that bring them together. But in a covalent bond, the electrons aren't given up or accepted; they're simply shared between the two atoms, and that's what we call a covalent bond. And covalent bonds are strong bonds, stronger than ionic bonds. And actually, to be qualified as a molecule, the two atoms have to be bonded together in a covalent bond, one or more covalent bonds. So when we use the word molecule, for example, a water molecule, you'll see that water molecules are covalently bonded. The two hydrogens of the H2O are bonded to the oxygen with two covalent bonds. Another example is carbon dioxide. Each oxygen is bound to the carbon atom through sharing of electrons, and that's what we call a covalent bond. So CO2 is also a covalently bonded molecule. Now, CO2 and H2O and even O2 in that first example, while bound together with covalent bonds and classified as molecules, they are not alive. And so let's talk about something that's actually inside a living organism, for example, DNA. DNA is actually part of the living organism. And each small sphere you see there in the diagram represents an atom. And so I blew up a picture in the middle of the screen for you of a building block of DNA. It's called a nucleotide, and each nucleotide is made up of multiple atoms, different kinds of atoms, all covalently bonded to each other. So the carbons and the nitrogens and the oxygens and the hydrogens are all bound to each other with covalent bonds, and sometimes more than one covalent bond. That's what makes DNA such a strong and useful molecule, because it's bound together by very strong covalent bonds. First of all, atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, but I bet you already knew that. Secondly, our elemental symbols from the periodic table give us information about specific types of atoms. You can find out the number of protons and electrons and neutrons by examining the symbol from the periodic table. Also, ions are atoms that have gained or lost electrons, and we use sodium as an example and also chlorine as an example. And when sodium and chlorine get together, they get together with an ionic bond. Because the ions form, they attract each other, and they form an ionic bond, and so we would say that NaCl, or salt, is an ionic compound. When atoms share electrons, they form stronger bonds called covalent bonds. And if two or more atoms are bound together with covalent bonds, we call them molecules. But hopefully you've gained a greater appreciation for our main idea for this video, which is that all living things are based on atoms and their interactions. Those interactions are the bonds that the atoms share with each other to form either ionic compounds or covalently bonded molecules. So that's chapter 2.1, and I'll see you for our next video tutorial.